Hi, everybody. We're group 4. My name is Crystal Cow.
My name is Snowy Calderon.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marvin.
All right, Marvin, take us to the shared screen, please. Our topic is on climate change and the human impact on polar bears in the Arctic.
The understanding of climate change has evolved ever since the ancient Greeks. People believed that they could affect the rainfall by plowing and tree cutting. While this was not far off the truth, the future revealed that there were by far more negative effects than positive ones. The idea that humankind can alter the climate on a global scale seemed outlandish for many centuries. The greenhouse effect, established in 1820, at first looked like a possibility to heat up the Earth and balance out the extremes of the season. As a matter of fact, the greenhouse effect is positive to the Earth without human impact. It was not until James Hansen, a NASA scientist, spoke out publicly that the theory of global warming and humans' contribution to climate change became an international concern. He was to 99% confident that climate change was real, and in 1988, his statement started the conversation. So what is climate change? Climate change is an expression of variations in our climate which persist for a longer period of time, if not decades. The term has been established since the Industrial Revolution, largely in connection to global warming. Since the emission of gases impacting the greenhouse effect have been increasing dramatically. Those 5 gases are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, water vapor. All these gases originated from population size, economic activity, lifestyle, energy use, land use patterns, technology, and climate policy. To translate these origins into proportion can be seen in this graphic. But to actually visualize the greenhouse effect and how these gases translate into global warming is seen here. This graphic displays the difference between the natural greenhouse effect on the left and how humankind impacted the natural cycle as seen on the right. The greenhouse gases and aerosols affect climate by altering incoming solar radiation and outgoing infrared thermal radiation that are part of Earth's energy balance. Changing the atmospheric abundance or properties of these gases and particles can lead to a warming or cooling of the climate system. But as we can see on the right side, less heat is released and stays contained. Having established the understanding of global warming, we get to the main focus of this presentation: human impact on the Arctic, which has caused the melting of ice caps and is threatening the polar bear's existence. The shifts in the Arctic environment have not only been caused by global warming, further factors are enhancing the effects of it: overfishing, invasive species, tourism, pollution, exploration and exploitation of mineral reserves. But before we get into the details of each individual cause, where is the Arctic actually, and what is it? The Arctic is an area at the northernmost part of our Earth. As we can see in the graphic, it borders onto Alaska, Canada, Finland, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, and Sweden. Since it is a polar region and consists of the Arctic Ocean and adjacent seas, it overlaps with some of the above-mentioned countries. The surface of the Arctic is reliant on the seasons, since its mainland is formed out of permafrost, which contains tundra, but is extended by the sea ice in many places. So one can imagine how climate change is not only reducing the seasonal sea ice, but more concerning is that it starts to decrease and disrupt the mainland, leaving new opportunities to the fishing industry. Overfishing. Overfishing enhances pollution and climate change by its impact. The ecosystem's balance gets thrown off by commercial fishing procedures. For example, if an area gets stripped of all its dominant fish, their prey will overpopulate and ultimately strip itself of its food supply by overpopulation. Unfortunately, the imbalance in an ecosystem causes a ripple effect, and more prominent causes like reduced biodiversity, resource depletion, reduced biological growth rates, and low biomass levels will apply. The awareness of the impact on the environment led to 9 nations, plus the EU, signing the Central Arctic Ocean Agreement at a ceremony in Greenland, in an attempt to protect a big portion of the Arctic Sea over at least the next 16 years. But there are more threats to the ecosystem than just overfishing, like invasive species. Invasive species can have negative consequences where they outcompete native animals for food. Further impacts can be causing extinction of native plants and animals, reducing biodiversity, competing with native organisms, and for limited resources and altering habitats. This can result in a huge economic impacts and fundamental disruptions in the Arctic ecosystem. While these impacts are indirect responses to humankind wrongdoings, there are more direct impacts like tourism. Tourism is a problem on the rise, especially facing the loss of the Arctic ice. In the past few years, the Arctic has been put in focus as a new and expanding tourism destination. Due to easy accessibility allowed by warmer temperatures and an increased demand for so-called last chance tourism, or also extinction tourism, which affects also other vulnerable destinations threatened by climate change, such as the Great Barrier Reef. In some Arctic areas, tourism, especially cruise tourism, is one of the fastest growing economic sectors. The new gained mobility is not only beneficial to tourism, it as well offers new possibilities for exploration and exploitation of mineral reserves while polluting the Arctic. The primary cause is burning fossil fuels, which results in the accumulation of greenhouse gases. Burning oil, coal, and gas traps heat in the atmosphere, increasing temperatures, causing glaciers and ice sheets to melt. Furthermore, drilling for fossil fuels is also a significant contributor to climate change. These processes emit methane, which locks in heat even more effectively than carbon dioxide. In the next portion of the presentation, we're going to assess those effects of climate change on polar bears.
So the effects of climate change on polar bears. So polar bears are facing problems with their food supply due to changes in their hunting ground. The Arctic Sea is melting, being negatively affected. These changes to the Arctic Sea are negatively impacting the food source of the polar bears, which includes seals, and that's a major food source for them. So a 121-pound seal can provide 8 days worth of energy, but the bear needs a lot more food to survive the weather, the climate, the cold. So the recent changes in the ice have created a drop in seal population, which has negatively impacted the bears' overall health. Health and body changes are a result of this. Changes in the ice formation cycles are causing polar bears to eat less and remain hungry for longer periods of time. The reproduction of new generations stand threatened. Pollutants in the water and ice negatively impact the bear's immune system. Female polar bears are forced to eat less, which result in malnourished cubs. Scientists are also discovering female body sizes are shrinking. There's some evidence that suggests polar bears are adapting and moving to areas like Canada and Greenland. So some of them are surviving, and some are being negatively impacted. So the environmental changes. Due to climate change, the jet stream has shown warmer air is reaching farther north. An increase of temperature causes the Arctic ice to melt, which brings changes in the ice cycle. The ice melts and the ecosystem declines. Polar bears face challenges to their health and population. Polar bears depend on the Arctic ice for hunting and mating. These chain of events create less space, less food, and lower overall health for the bears. So in this slide, I provided 2 videos that's gonna show a bit more information. And if you could click on that.
Arctic polar bears are facing near extinction by the end of the century if the sea ice they depend on continues to disappear. That's the stark warning from a new study looking at the long-term future of the bears as greenhouse gas emissions contribute to the melting of the bears' frozen hunting grounds. Our science correspondent Victoria Gill has the story.
They are the poster species for climate change. Predators that depend on a fragile, transient hunting ground, the Arctic sea ice. And this study has shown that polar bears' survival is tied to that ice. The scientists used models based on satellite data to forecast sea ice decline in the Arctic over the coming decades. That enabled them to predict a future tipping point, to create a timeline for when the frozen hunting season will be too short for the bears to fatten up before the summer. At the current rate of warming, the researchers say all but a few polar bear populations will collapse before 2100.
With less fat, they're entering a fasting season that's longer than it used to be.
So is that now unavoidable? Are we already on that trajectory to just lose polar bears?
The trajectory that we're on now is not a good one. But if society gets its act together globally, we can halt global warming in time to save polar bears. And if we do, we'll benefit the rest of life on Earth, including ourselves.
The consequences of climate change are already playing out in the Arctic landscape. And this new timeline, the researchers say, is a stark reminder that the survival of an entire species is at stake. Victoria Gill, BBC News.
In 1978, satellites began continuously observing the polar regions, and the dynamic beauty of the Arctic sea ice was revealed. What we expect to be a solid mass of ice is actually in constant motion. As researchers continue to seek a deeper understanding of this region, new information about how sea ice changes is coming to light.
In this animation, we're taking Arctic sea ice into the third dimension. Here, we're looking at the ice age, which is an indicator of thickness. Generally, older ice is thicker ice.
That's the voice of Dr. Walt Meyer, senior research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center.
What you see in this animation is the ice pulsing out and in with the seasons. In winter, the ice grows out and expands outward. In summer, it contracts inward as it melts. You see the whiter ice, which is the older ice, moving around the Arctic, being pushed around by winds and currents that move the ice. Over the years, the ice pulses around and moves around towards the top along the coast of Greenland. The older ice eventually moves out of the Arctic and into the North Atlantic, where it melts. The ice gets replenished within the Arctic because some of the ice survives each summer and grows older. And particularly in a region north of Alaska called the Beaufort Sea, where the ice spins around in a clockwise direction called the Beaufort Gyre. And that ice can keep spinning around, oftentimes for several years, and gradually getting older and thus getting thicker. Eventually, the ice will spin out of that gyre and go out through Fram Strait. In the past, we've always had enough ice growth and ice aging, enough ice surviving the summers to replenish the older ice that's lost. But in recent years, we've seen less replenishment. There's been more melt during the summer, so the ice that goes out through Fram Strait has not been compensated by the ice growth. In addition, especially in recent years, we've seen some pretty remarkable things in the Beaufort Sea, where that area that used to be a nursery for the development of the older ice allowed the young ice to age and mature. What we've seen instead is the ice is now more broken up, more scattered, and that's allowing the older ice to melt within the Beaufort Sea. So we're seeing the Beaufort Sea go from a nursery to a graveyard for older ice. As we get towards the more recent years, much of that oldest ice, the ice that's older than 5 years old in the bright white, has almost virtually disappeared from the Arctic Ocean. And the Arctic is now dominated by younger and thinner ice.
So climate change is altering the Arctic environment, generating problems for the polar bear population. The melting ice is allowing for the expansion of trade routes, creating an increase in industrialization That introduces overfishing, deep sea drilling, and an increased risk for pollution. Recently, in May of 2020, the Norilsk diesel oil spill occurred in Russia, causing them to go into a state of emergency. That's really harming the environment. Traces of pesticides and industrial compounds have been found on glacier ice north of Scandinavia. The origin of the pollutants was traced back to the US, Russia, and China. These unfortunate events have caused polar bears to travel further out in search of resources that are very limited and contributes to the overall decline of the Arctic ice and ecosystem. So now I'm going to pass it off to Crystal to go ahead and continue the rest of the presentation.
Climate change effect on polar bears. The polar bears rely on the sea ice to hunt for seals. If the sea ice continues to disappear at the rate that we see now, the species will not be able to breed and feed. By the end of the century, we would have wiped out the entire species. As feeding gets harder for the bears, they adapt to different methods of hunting for food and move to the land. Between 2010 and 2014, there were 15 polar bear attacks on humans, the greatest number ever recorded in a 4-year period. Nursing mothers also get trapped with their cubs in collapsing dens due to the melting ice caps. Melting glaciers threaten other wildlife if flooding destroys the land. Glaciers are part of a unique ecosystem that also serve to feed other wildlife. The natural runoff of glacier water reaches areas where the soil nourishes the vegetation. Some animals feed off of the healthy land, who then become prey for other animals, and so goes the circle of life. The future of an endangered species. Researching polar bears is important in projecting climate change impact in the Arctic. The USGS and Fish and Wildlife Services are some of the organizations conducting these studies. Records of the threatening population and environmental changes are vital in the data that influence the necessary decisions made by management. New technologies. The constant evolution of technology has allowed researchers to practice far more advanced methods of data tracking, along with minimally invasive exercises on wildlife. Some of these new projects include improvements to tracking devices that are attached to the bear's fur rather than satellite collar, GPS, ear tags, and implants. Engineers have improved these devices to withstand the extreme Arctic conditions. BJ Kirchhoffer, I believe the name is, Director of Field Operations of the Burr on Fur project said, "Remote tracking allows us to understand the movement patterns and behavior of polar bears, along with the information such as habitat use, responses to changing sea ice conditions, and population boundaries. It's critical data in the changing Arctic." Another advancement in research are drone studies. Here is an image of an Intel drone that spots a polar bear in the Arctic landscape using infrared detection. It is becoming more challenging for scientists to reach locations where the ice caps are melting. Conditions are dangerous for the helicopter to fly, and the cost is very expensive. Light aircraft is the #1 killer of wildlife biologists. With the improvements made to drones, research crews are able to stealthily navigate the Arctic tundra without risking lives, disturbing natural habitats, and scaring away their subjects. Upgrades allow high-resolution imagery and higher performance.
Not knowing what to think of it, she reared up onto her hind legs to get a better view. After investigating the drone further, the family retreated into the wilderness.
So that was an example of how the drones are really helping advance the research of the Arctic polar bears without having to disturb them. I thought that was quite cute. So where do we go from here? Protection laws. Strong endangered species laws and protected areas are two critical tools to protect the polar bears. Hunting is government regulated in Greenland and the United States. Hunting is banned in Norway and parts of Russia. The International Agreement on Conservation of Polar Bears and Their Habitats in 1973, the United States Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, the Endangered Species Act, and the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora are all acts to protect polar bears and their habitats. But natives are still hunting polar bears, which are a critical source of revenue to northern communities, with pelts selling for around $5,000. The ESA alone cannot protect and regulate the shrinking habitat and population of the polar bears. They still remain vulnerable to the harmful effects of global warming. So what can I do to help? You can reduce emissions and save energy, implement the 3 sustainable R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, change your diet to a low carbon and local one, minimize your carbon footprint, take action to save the planet by getting involved with organizations, and most importantly, demand sustainable measures and elect officials who support a sustainable future. Participate in solutions. Make our planet great again. Make sure to register to vote at vote.gov and cast your ballot this November 2nd. All right, thank you, Marvin. Go ahead and end the recording.